Well, Adam, thank you very much for joining me. Now, kick off first of all, how did the idea of Yammer come about?
Good question. It was pretty simple. We saw the rise of consumer social networking. Myself and David Sachs, who was the other co-founder of Yammer, David Sachs started a company called Genie, which was a consumer social network for families. And it was very obvious that the changes we saw in sort of how people were communicating in the consumer space, if you will, was going to come into the enterprise. I don't think then we knew exactly what the impact would be on companies. We just knew that it was going to be a big deal. And so it was sort of on that premise that we sort of took a lot of those ideas from the consumer space and made Yammer. But in the end, we ended up realizing that enterprise social ends up being very different from consumer social.
Right.
And I think the success of Yammer was, even though I think we did a good job, was more right place, right time, in that there were so many changes happening in companies anyway. There was all these new movements around employee empowerment and communicating differently and working more collaboratively that Yammer sort of perfectly fit into. And so I think we've been sort of riding that wave of, I guess you loosely think of as the future of work, perfectly, you know?
Now, you mentioned there that the enterprise side is different to the consumer side. Now, you talk a lot about the consumerization of business IT. How different did you see it?
We didn't know what was different in the beginning. What became obvious as we went along was that consumer social is really about who you know. It's keeping track of people you know in a more effective way. Enterprise social is less about who you know and more about what you need to know to do your job better. So you can almost look at enterprise social as we're already working together with people in companies, in our, with our coworkers. We're already communicating with them, collaborating, creating documents, but the work that we do with them only benefits the people we work with.
Right.
Social takes the work we're already doing, the communication we're already having, and opens it up so that it can benefit a wider audience. So that as people are faced with new information, new challenges, new decisions to make, they have a broader context to make better decisions. And so the aim of social really is to take all of that work and communication and make it available more broadly.
Right. And this is a big change we're seeing in the workplace. What success stories have you heard out of implementing tools like Yammer in large corporations?
Well, it's interesting too. I was just talking to someone about how we thought that Yammer would take off in particular verticals first, but it ended up being across the board, certain companies across all verticals and all sizes. Because it ended up being less about the vertical and more about whether the company was prepared for that kind of cultural changes required to find success with social. The cultural changes of wanting to empower employees, being okay with increased transparency, being okay with increased experimentation, those kinds of things. And so, locally, Telstra is a huge customer of ours that has talked about how it's flattened their ranks. It has flattened or shortened the feedback cycles with their management and their frontline employees, help people collaborate better. Rio Tinto has talked about how they had this goal of reducing their costs by something like $5 billion in the next couple of years, and they just asked the network. They said, hey, work together to figure out ways of doing this. And people found out that they had different contracts with the same vendors, different equipment across their company that had different sort of ROI. And so just working in the network, they were able to, in almost a more social way, achieve their objectives. And one of the other interesting ones I'll say is we've seen a dramatic increase in the amount of non-knowledge workers that are getting connected on Yammer, whether that's, we have a large grocery store chain called Kroger, 300,000 employees, own a ton of groceries across the US. And they are putting all of their frontline employees, baggers, butchers, checkers, on Yammer so that they can iterate on things like improved customer experience, better display cases. They're using all of these employees as knowledge workers. So it's sort of across the board, but all along those same ideas of companies that realize they have to empower their employees to learn and respond faster to the onslaught of change.
So it seems to me that that's taking the corporate knowledge within the organisation that previously was being ignored and empowering those lower level workers.
Yeah. There's this great quote from General McChrystal where he said that the wisest decisions are made by those closest to the problem, regardless of seniority. And so that's what I said. In some respects, it was already this employee empowerment movement that had started before Yammer, but Yammer fit into that because what does it mean to empower people? It means they're empowered to have a voice, to give feedback, and to respond to situations as they happen. And so in some respects, Yammer gives that feedback mechanism, but it also creates transparency in decisions that lets leaders empower people because they can see what's happening. It's not like it's happening in a vacuum.
Yeah, it seems to me that could be a challenge to some managers, being transparent, having their workers empowered. Have you hit any resistance on that?
Tons, yeah. There was I think it was a Gartner study that came out a while ago about the number of enterprise social rollouts that fail. And for us, it's very obvious that it's a cultural problem, not a technology problem. There's no challenge for rolling out social technologically. There's no high integration costs. But if you think you're going to use social but control everything and still treat employees like cogs, and it's not going to work, obviously. And so, yeah, in many respects, we find ourselves at the sort of nexus in these companies, as sort of at the pivotal point in these companies where half the company gets it and wants to work differently, the other half doesn't. Sometimes we find ourselves as mediators between the CIO and the CEO, and it's really interesting. But we're sort of watching this happening on the front seat, and in many ways, we think that just the acceleration of companies recognizing that they need to work differently and being more public about it, like the Telstra CEO, creates pressure on other companies. That's the biggest thing holding Yammer back. It's not that we can't reach people. It's entrenched middle management that doesn't want to empower employees. And so the more that changes, the more social is going to just permeate and become the sort of default way of working.
Looking at some of those big companies that have successfully bought in Yammer, it seems to me that it's the senior management. So we talk about Telstra, David Thodey, driving that. Do you find that's the common factor amongst those successes?
What has happened most of the time is that Yammer tends to start bottom up. It starts to get some bottom up adoption. Some employees, some teams might adopt it, but there definitely is a limit to how far bottom up adoption can go. At some point, you need executive sponsorship to really sanction it and to sort of accelerate adoption. So with accelerating that adoption, it's interesting with that a lot of this, traditionally it's been in the PC model, it's been low levels have brought in that new technologies, if you like. So whether we're talking about PCs or cloud, in this case though, it seems that the executives are having to come in much earlier to get that adoption to happen. Yeah, it depends on the company, but it's such a different. It is going to change though, because when Yammer started, it was a standalone enterprise social network, and therefore it was quite high friction for people to leave the tools they were already working in to go work socially in Yammer. And the reason why we were excited to become a part of Microsoft is most of the work that's done in companies is done in products that Microsoft makes. And so if we're successful in weaving in social into those products, into the active document creation and collaboration and better email interop, then I think you're going to see, just as that friction decreases, much, much higher adoption.
Right.
It'll become much more obvious how this applies to work, that this is really a tool that you use for work. It'll make it easier, for executives to want to experiment with it. But frankly, I think that the biggest shift in adoption is going to be seeing other CEOs, seeing other successful companies begin to accelerate because they're working differently. And that's going to create a lot of pressure on traditional companies to accept the fact that they're going to have to work differently in order to compete.
Yeah. So you're a year into your journey with Microsoft. How's that been going?
It's fascinating. We on one hand, Yammer had a lot of theories about big companies and how that worked, and now we're a part of a big company. And so it's been helpful for us to even understand our customers more. Microsoft is itself in a period of major transformation. When we got there, they were just coming off their last 3-year release of Office, saying we're going to release. First they said every quarter, then every month, and Jeff Teeper said that they were going to try to get to where they could release every week. And so we're in the midst of this transformation. It's so much more than just a delivery mechanism, the cloud. It's a change in how they work and organize, and we've been lucky to be a big part of that. Yammer was born in the cloud. We were only ever cloud. We build Yammer very differently than most companies build software. The way that we organize our teams, the amount of agility we have. We sometimes joke that our development methodology is post-Agile. It's sort of beyond Scrum and all this because they weren't fast enough. They didn't respond to data fast enough. And so we've been working with Microsoft to figure out, how do you do that at scale? How do you do that at the scale of Office? How do you do that at the scale of Microsoft? So it's been really interesting. I think that if we had come in a year earlier, a year later, it would not have gone as well, because a year earlier, they hadn't, they were still sort of heads down working on the next version of Office. A year later, might have already come to their own conclusions about things. We hit them right at the right time, where there was a lot of appreciation for the need to change, and we came in saying we had some really great ideas for the way you do this in the cloud, and so there was a lot of humility and a lot of acceptance of new ideas.
Now, it's interesting you say there that post-Scrum, post-Agile, that would really terrify a lot of managers.
They're just getting Agile now.
Exactly.
I know. I know.
So where do you see the development process going next?
Yeah. The problem with Agile, as we understand it today, and the Agile Manifesto specifically was good. The problem with things like Scrum is they're still making this one, we'll say, fundamental flaw, and it is a parallel to the problem with companies in general, which there wasn't a lot of new information, so you want to just lock things in place.
Yeah.
And we focused primarily in the past on efficiency. And in many ways, things like Scrum attempt to make you more agile, but still focus on efficiency. Everyone's sort of task-based and hours and burn down points and all that.
Yeah.
The name of the game now is not efficiency. It's how quickly you can learn and respond to information. Yammer is less a product as it is a set of experiments running at all times, where we're getting data back on what's working, what's not. We don't, we take bold guesses about the future, but then we try to disprove our hypotheses to get there.
Right.
But we needed a different model so that we could very quickly move around resources as we learned information. And so we came up with this, post-agile model of these small, autonomous, cross-functional teams of 2 to 10 people for 2 to 10 weeks that could release as much as they wanted to prove or disprove a hypothesis to get back data that would let us very quickly move resources around to double down on that, to do something else. And we're seeing that model of sort of working across the org chart cross-functionally in shorter sprints whose purpose is to get back data, but then sort of quick reorientation of resources. We're seeing other companies, even outside of software development, adopt that model, whether that's in retail or... it was a great example. One of our customers, Red Robin, they're a hamburger chain in the US, and they wanted to figure out how to release burgers faster. It's the same thing as software, because they figured if they could release burgers faster, they would reduce the cost of failure. Therefore, they could increase the rate of experimentation, get more data back. The way they've achieved that is by putting their employees, the frontline servers, on Yammer, so they can get real-time feedback about how burgers are doing. They can do smaller batch releases. They can test it out, get back feedback, iterate faster.
Yep.
And they released this one burger. What would have taken 18 months, they did in 4 weeks. And that's it's a huge step change. But again, decrease the cost of failure, increase the feedback loops with their customers. That is, in a weird way, that model of sort of getting all the signals you can as fast as you can to learn information and reorient your resources is, I think, how companies are going to orient in the future.
Yeah. So where do you see that future going?
In what sense?
Well, with this increased collaborative workplace, you mentioned a hamburger chain there, and we've been talking about telcos.
Yeah.
How far do you see this changing business?
It's huge. It's huge. I mean, I personally believe that we haven't seen a major change in how companies work since the Industrial Revolution. And we're, I think, on the brink of a change as large as that one.
Right.
Where so many of the old ways we operated companies, so many of the old metaphors just fall down now. But it's not that we're going to throw away hierarchies altogether and it'll be something else, but it is the case that we're going to be completely reorienting companies for how quickly we can learn and respond to information.
Yeah.
And figure out how much we can decentralize decision making, because that's the fastest way you can respond. Because when an employee learns that they're going to respond immediately.
Yeah.
How much context and information can you push to the edges? It's going to be a radical change for what it means to be a leader in a company. Because no longer is it about telling people what to do.
Yeah.
It's now just about setting direction and vision and frameworks for making decisions, and then trying to sort of see the output and make sure that the system is working. I mean, again, we're seeing this at sort of small scales, and in some cases, at very few cases in big scales. But the next couple of years are going to be interesting, because the few companies that begin to really figure this out, we think, are going to accelerate significantly faster than their peers.
So it's a really big, important thing to be grabbing hold of for a lot of businesses in each case.
It's huge.
Yeah. Well, Adam, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks. My pleasure.